Welcome to tonight's lecture. I think you're going to find it quite an event. I'm not going to lay out the credentials. Thank you for that. Of something, it would be sort of silly to lay out the credentials of a lifetime of performances that are so well known that they don't need to be justified. And what you're about to see is a performance, a kind of mastery that if I discuss it much, all it will do is, what do they call that in a review where it says warning, don't ruin the ending. So, no matter who you are, this will be true. If you're a practitioner and you're wondering how the heck you get so much work, you'll find out. And if you're a teacher and you wonder how he takes tried and true values and turns them into transcendental cosmic truths, you'll find out. So I'm not going to tell you too much more. It would be very easy to me to go on for a very long time about Harry Cobb's amazing generosity and mentorship of many young architects, some of which quite famous today, but at one time, while he was mentoring them, not so, like Daniel Libeskind, and others quite well known, like Wes Jones and Andrew Zago, who really will do anything to come spend any time with him at all. And it comes from a kind of amazing, authentic generosity and care and concern for his colleagues. It doesn't matter what age his colleagues are. It's not about mentoring young people like a Boy Scout troop leaders. It's more like having conversations with colleagues about architecture no matter where the ideas come from. Today he spent most of his master class with the G-Theory class discussing ideas that came out of a log essay by Scott Cohen. You know, he keeps up with the log, he reads log, and Scott Cohen, another student, was just discussed like a colleague. So it was amazing. One of those persons is me. I met Harry Cobb in an incredible story that you could not possibly imagine as being true. It's not a story in the end about me or Harry. It's a story about the incredible impudence of Peter Eisenman and the fabulous power of every dean at Harvard, but the particular tolerance and generosity of one dean, Gerald McHugh. So we turned out not to be the centerpiece of the story, and I won't tell you the story, but it ends up with me meeting Harry at Harvard and his being, again, gracious and receiving, and me forming a deep and sincere attachment. Now the line, I think, from Streetcar Named Desire is sick people form such deep and sincere attachment, so I won't pursue it too much. So instead I'm going to do something, this is a kind of Valentine to Harry that I've put together. This has really got to do with a long, long interest I've had in a kind of weird side of Harry Cobb's architecture. Because the auspicious and fabulous side of it is well known to everybody, and you'll get to see more of it tonight. But I've known aspects of his architecture that are very strange, and I've always wanted to write this essay called The Strange Case of Harry Cobb. And I've talked about it, and I've lectured about it. So tonight I just thought I'd show you little bitty glimpses of it. So just put up with me a few minutes. It's not a very well-prepared lecture, but... So this is, of course, the John Hancock building, which he will discuss. But it begins with my obsession with that black stripe, or dent, or whatever you want to call it. Because every time I've heard him lecture or discuss it, he never talks about it. And then when he talks about it, he really wants to get away from the subject very quickly. He wants to say, well, it's really obvious. It's the core, and the core projects into something. I mean, he really has no concept of this building. He has no idea what it does, why it was designed. I don't even think he's met the architect. I'm happy to explain it to you at some later point, but it's one of the most incredible magic tricks ever in the history of architecture. It's basically, how do you take a 60-story high-rise and make it disappear? But this black stripe has really been bugging me for a long time, until I realized it makes it look like there's two towers. It's not like a black stripe. It makes it look like the shadow of the small tower is being cast on the big tower. And this is where I began to discover something in Harry's work that's gone on and on and on and on and on. And that's this obsession with uncanny doubling. And he will call it dynamic symmetry. And in fact, he called it dynamic symmetry today. And it's about symmetries in which one side is slightly smaller than the other, slightly off the other. I don't know if doesn't it look like a shadow? I mean, it kind of gets reinforced like a shadow. So all of a sudden, this one tower looks like two towers. And it's slightly, I don't know, horrifying. Now, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cases like this, and I'm not going to show them all to you, but my favorite one of all, this is the effect of dynamic symmetry that I think you'll see. And so it's these two together. This is the most spectacular case of all of that double symmetry. These are the Center for Government and International Studies at Harvard, and you'll notice that it's the twins rotated opposite from each other, and Cambridge Street goes right down the middle of it. Now, it's pretty weird from here, but when you're walking down that street, this is exactly what you see. As you look on the left and you think, wow, that's a nice kind of weird building, and I get the geometry, it's very simple. Then you look on the right and you go, whoa, wait a minute, what's that? Then I thought about this a lot. In his lecture, he starts talking about the Carpenter Center. I thought, wait a minute. This is nothing but the Carpenter Center reinstalled back at Harvard, because as he discusses the Carpenter Center, he's lamenting for Corb, because Corb, instead of getting to be built on the quadrangle, he got ostracized to the outskirts of Harvard. And so the entire analysis of the road through the two lobes was a lament by Corb and a kind of aggressive act of brilliance, what he calls a nuclear work of architecture. And I realized Harry has just been thrown off of the Harvard campus. He doesn't have another building on the Harvard campus, and so he's feeling a kind of sympathy with Corb, and maybe kind of a nightmarish sympathy with Corb, and coming from the world in which Doug Raff runs. Alex Mann and I tried to work out the transformational drawings. You can kind of see how it happens. And as I was doing this, I thought, there's something really weird about this, because if you do exactly the same geometrical transformation that changes the lobe into the little, you can see it, so the teardrop, if you did that to B, it would change it to R, and it would change Cobb to Corb. And it's a very interesting thing we started to think about. And so anyway, I don't want you to think this is the only horrific side of Harry, and so I'm going to show you one little thing. He's also done recently an installation at SciArc. Okay, Dustin, there you go. And this is just a little film of the installation. And where he decided to build a hypostyle hall, and the idea was he was going to take 3x8 doors that he bought at Lowe's or something like that. 3x8 because they're the most humane proportions of a door. And then he was going to build a hypostyle, and inside this gallery, and this is how you can see it working. These are people walking around through it. And those are the hypostyles, and then those are the doors, and it's quite a brilliant piece of architecture. But as you look at it and as you study it, you realize there's something very weird about it. Like, this is it in perspective. What's weird about it is it's really a scary place. You can hide in it. In fact, it's so scary, it becomes the very apotheosis of what you don't do in a city. So let me show it to you from the beginning. So there you are, alone in the city, all by yourself on the city street, and then that happens. And so this humane, fantastic memory of the Imperial Hypostyle Hall now turned into this turns into the most radical installation in the history of SciArc, and I'm about to review it. So that's the last of it, except for one thing hit me, and I just want to go back to this little Corb and Cobb thing, and that is a memory of this drawing, which is the interior of the Carpenter Center, and these little desks that were designed by Le Corbusier, which are oddly identical to Harry's hypostyle constructions. Little two pieces of 2x4, cross-braced. So, on that note, I want you to welcome my dear friend and somebody I'm really looking forward to your response to, Harry Cobb.
Okay. Get it for you. Let me start it for you, okay?
That's it, perfect, thank you. I'm going to take this and put it up there. Well, Jeff, that was wonderful. Thank you. I certainly have no intention of making any claim on an analogy between COBB and CORB, but I really appreciate your analogies, and I'm delighted to be here with you and with Wes Jones for these seminars and for this lecture. Now, as a prologue to my talk this evening, something's not working.
Try now.
Okay, thank you. I want to draw your attention to a short essay by Sanford Quinter, in which he declared, "I, for one, firmly believe in the power of memory, in radical anamnesis, as a genuine act of political resistance in our structurally amnesiac and personality disassociating social world." In the same essay, he went on to remark that Thomas Pynchon, in his 1973 epic Gravity's Rainbow, invokes the concept of temporal bandwidth, a literal scale on which to measure the degree to which one's being remains psychically and existentially linked to its past and oriented towards its future. The more cut off from these it is, as the temporal bandwidth shrinks, the more its being becomes concentrated in an increasingly detached present. The more unmoored it becomes, and the less it is able to rely on stabilizing continuities of coherent unfolding or becoming. And Quinter concludes, the antidote is the flexibility afforded by controlled remembering, not only of what we were, but in the same emancipatory act of what we might be. Memory as a deliberate act of will projects one squarely into the stream of history, beyond the shackles, the smug certainties, and the petty stakes of the present. Through selective memory, the future becomes possible, a future that the past could not think, and that the present alone dares not. Now, three considerations have led me to invoke Quinter's words as prologue. First, they resonate profoundly with my own experience, which has taught me that controlled remembering, a rigorously disciplined act of recollection having nothing to do with nostalgia, is indeed essential to the practice, or at least to my practice of architecture. Second, my talk this evening, during which I will touch on a few of my built works across 65 years of practice, is itself necessarily an act of radical anamnesis. And third, Quinter's plea for the emancipatory power of controlled remembering is, I believe, worthy of more extensive discussion than it receives nowadays in the discourse around architecture. So my decision to look at built works, including a few of my own, through the lens of radical anamnesis may correctly be seen not just as an apologia pro vita sua, but also as a gentle provocation to debate. I need hardly remind this audience that like every art, architecture has its own voice. And as with every art, it is the distinctive revelatory power of that voice, something not flowing from any other source, that ultimately validates architecture's claim on our attention, its appeal to our imagination, and its authority as an indispensable manifestation of our culture. Now, a characteristic predicament in the program of society to which the voice of architecture has often been eloquently responsive is the occurrence of ambiguity, paradox, and contrariety in the purposes that buildings are asked to serve. As a matter of fact, the need to acknowledge and often to celebrate the coexistence of divergent and apparently irreconcilable intentions or ideas is a theme recurring throughout the entire history of Western architecture. To give substance to this claim and bring it into sharper focus, let's go immediately to cases, summoning radical anamnesis to consider several well-known built works that are in this respect paradigmatic. The Church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, designed by Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Thales, was built by command of the Emperor Justinian and dedicated in 537 AD. The richly orchestrated spatial drama of this great church arises from its hybrid nature, the superimposition of a domical building form on a basilican ground plan. Structurally, Hagia Sophia is a brilliant tour de force, but this accolade does not begin to explain the emotive intensity of its interior. What stirs us in this extraordinary polyphonic composition is the bringing together of two powerful but opposite intentions: stability, absolutism, wholeness, symmetry, juxtaposed with asymmetry, incompleteness, anxiety, and aspiration. Each of these two opposing value systems is rendered eloquent by the presence of the other, and they are synthesized in a way that greatly intensifies the dialogue between them. Here, architecture has given voice to St. Augustine's conception of love as a dynamic, energizing force, a forward movement of the mind. And yet, here we also see this characteristic Christian impulse, this anxiety of spirit, brilliantly joined with its opposite, a reassertion of absolutism and immutability in the temporal affairs of mankind. Among the works of the 16th century architect Andrea Palladio, one of my favorites is the Palazzo Caricati in Vicenza. Here we see the resolution in architecture of a different kind of paradox. Are we to read this masterful array of superimposed orders as the projecting porch of a private house, or as the colonnaded enclosure of a public square? Marvelously, it is both. And this splendid ambiguity gives the building a richness and poignancy which is entirely owing to the architect's skill in simultaneously acknowledging these entirely opposite intentions. The key invention here is the audacious clustering of columns, a breathtakingly brilliant device by which the otherwise evenly spaced colonnade has been articulated and given its double meaning, at once a public arcade and a private entry. The miracle is that the architecture of the building is in no way compromised, rather it draws its particular vigor from the necessity of simultaneously promoting two very different readings of its posture in the city's public realm. In the 17th century church of San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane in Rome, Francesco Borromini gave entirely new meaning to the discourse between dome and basilica first evidenced in Hagia Sophia. Here we see both forms have been radically reshaped so as to produce a dynamic and highly integrated spatial construct wherein the aspirational and the immutable are joined to form a geometrically complex and infinitely suggestive whole. The indispensable operative element in this great work is the undulating entablature that distorts the array of columns below while forming a base for pendentives that then make the transition to oval dome above. The discourse thus engendered redefines the nature of the struggle between aspiration and absolutism. What in Hagia Sophia is presented as an unresolved conflict between church and state is here declared to be an unresolved conflict within the church itself, a conflict brought vividly to life by the genius of the architect. The Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard, you won't be surprised to see this, completed in 1964, is Le Corbusier's only built work in North America. This small but exceptionally complex and highly charged building masterfully addresses the disconcerting ambiguity of intent reflected in a seemingly hopeless disjunction between the aspirations of its program and the limitations of its site. The stated purpose to be served by the building was the integration of the visual arts, both their appreciation and their practice, into the everyday life of the college. But instead of being granted a suitably prominent place in the Harvard yard with its spacious quadrangles crisscrossed by diagonal paths, the Carpenter Center was relegated to a cramped and altogether marginal site hemmed in by pre-existing buildings. The architect's response to this dilemma was to compress the absent space of the campus into a single diagonal path in the form of an open-air ramp, plunging straight through the building and offering views into the studios at its heart. This extraordinary invention, the architectural equivalent of nuclear fusion in its compaction of energy, does not try to conceal but instead vividly dramatizes the building's awkward predicament, while at the same time artfully achieving the programmatic goals which that predicament would seem to have placed beyond reach. The Caltrans District 7 headquarters in downtown Los Angeles, completed in 2004, is one of Tom Main's most provocative built works, inviting a question similar to that raised by Palazzo Caricati. Is the enormous void in this building's otherwise impenetrable volume to be understood as a gathering place for its employee occupants, or as an extension of the city's public realm? And as with Palladio's great work, the answer is yes to both readings. But whereas in Vicenza this double reading is accomplished through the subtle articulation of a colonnaded porch, in Los Angeles it is the product of a boldly forceful voiding of the building volume and a complementary extension of a secondary volume so as to frame a civic space that oscillates marvelously between conditions of interiority and exteriority. This altogether thrilling space, further dramatized by Keith Saulnier's light installation, resolves without suppressing the paradoxical predicament of a public service bureaucracy grown so large that only a perfect act of architecture, as performed here, can make its presence not only tolerable but intensely meaningful to the public it serves. Diverse as they are in size, character, and purpose, all five of the buildings we've just seen, each a masterwork that could well be the subject of its own lecture, all vividly exemplify the remarkable capacity of architecture to illuminate ambiguity, paradox, and contrariety as they occur in the programs and purposes that buildings are asked to serve. In the course of my own by now quite long professional life, I've faced a number of challenges that invited, indeed compelled me to call on that same capacity, and I want to touch briefly on a few of these. But since I'm a stranger to most of you in this room, I should first inform you that my entire life as a practicing architect has been enabled and sustained by the firm of which I was one of 3 founders in 1955, and am today one of 8 partners among about 100 colleagues. Hence, while you will hear me speaking here often in the first person singular, please bear in mind that the built works to which I will refer are actually the products of extensive and close collaboration with close colleagues whose contributions have often been so much more than merely instrumental. Since its inception, our practice has embraced a wide variety of building types in cities across North America and around the world. And although I am wary of all generalizations, this breadth of experience permits me to declare that every built work of architecture inevitably embodies the convergence of histories that defined the moment of its creation. Note that I speak here of histories in the plural. I am referring to the separate narratives that lead up to, intersect, and necessarily infect each other in the making of architecture. These include the history of the host city, of the client institution, of the socio-cultural milieu in which it is embedded, and even of the architect who leads the design team. Inasmuch as this last will be the one constant in the discussion to follow, it is appropriate that I tell you first something about my own personal history. I'm one of a very small number of architects still practicing, or even living for that matter, who were trained under the teaching program established and led by Walter Gropius at Harvard from 1937 to 1952. Hence, I was the beneficiary or victim, depending on how you look at it, of an ideologically driven pedagogy that, through its mistreatment of history as much as through the methodology of its design studios, profoundly shaped the practice of architecture, especially, though not exclusively, in North America during the decades immediately following World War II. In characterizing the handling of history at Harvard under Gropius as mistreatment, I don't mean to imply that the abuse of history in schools of architecture was at that time unprecedented or even unusual. As a matter of fact, throughout the nearly 4 centuries since formal professional training was first introduced in France, there has never been a time when history has not been in some way misused as an instrument for placing the practice of architecture in the service of a prevailing ideology. But unlike earlier pedagogies, which privileged one historical period or style over another, the pedagogy of the modern movement as practiced by Gropius sought to protect the student from contamination by all of history, so as to clear the way for what was intended to be an entirely new architecture, liberated from the tyranny of dead styles, in which art, technology, and social purpose would be powerfully joined for the benefit of humanity. This attitude toward history, an attitude that reduces Pynchon's temporal bandwidth nearly to zero, is elegantly summed up in one of Franz Kafka's most memorable aphorisms. "The decisive moment in human history," he wrote, "is perpetually at hand. Hence, those revolutionary movements that declare everything preceding them to be null and void are in the right, for nothing has yet happened." Now, the perfect architectural analog to this aphorism, an analog that cast a powerful spell on the imagination of my generation of students, was Le Corbusier's Point Voisin of 1925, in which he proposed to eradicate the historic center of Paris, sparing only a few monuments, and replace it with an array of cruciform towers set in a vast green space. To understand the wide influence that this tabula rasa approach to city building had at mid-century, we need only notice the extraordinary proposal on the right by one of my own professors at Harvard, Martin Wagner. In response to a call for, quote, "the best planning ideas for renewing Boston," unquote, he suggested, I believe the year was 1944, that the entire downtown be erased and replaced with a single building in the shape of a gigantic question mark, as if to ask, why bother to renew it when you can just as well remove it? The image on the left shows the Boston of my childhood, a city that was full, self-satisfied, deeply resistant to change, a city wherein the Custom House Tower and the State House Dome remained as yet unchallenged on the skyline. As a student, I was wildly enthusiastic about Professor Wagner's proposal. It perfectly catered to my frustration and disgust with what I perceived to be the hopeless backwardness of my hometown, and at the same time it nourished my generation's hubristic confidence that we could, we should, and we would remake the world. My own Harvard thesis project, while more modest in scale, displayed an equal contempt for the historic fabric of Boston. Rather than work within that fabric, I chose to cast my proposal for urban housing as an aloof and emphatically autonomous cluster of towers rising out of the water adjacent to but disengaged from the city itself. By the time I submitted this project in March of 1949, just over 66 years ago, I had already convinced myself that Boston was hopelessly moribund, socially, economically, culturally, politically, and that nothing of interest to me was likely to happen there in my lifetime. So I abandoned my hometown and hurried off to New York to join I.M. Pei in his then fledgling practice under the auspices of the legendary developer William Zeckendorf Sr. Ironically, the reward for my early infidelity was a series of challenges that have obliged me to think deeply about Boston throughout most of the ensuing half-century. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first decade of my work with Pei took me much further afield in the service of Zeckendorf's insatiable appetite for large undertakings. Most notable among them, Place Ville-Marie, a 4 million square foot center city development in Montreal that would become his largest and remains my largest built work. When completed in 1962, the Royal Bank of Canada Tower was the tallest such building in Canada. Aside from taking note of its clearly derivative and oddly hybrid character, a body by Le Corbusier decked out in Messian drag, two remarks may be made about this early work. First, that it adheres strictly to the modernist conception of the tall building as a resolutely autonomous, self-referential organism shaped entirely by its own internal needs and systems. And second, that this huge urban development project, embracing more than 7 acres of land above Montreal's Central Railway Station, was very much the kind of opportunity that I had left Boston in search of. That is to say, a building project of a scale that invited radical reordering of the spatial, volumetric, and circulatory systems of the city. It was, of course, gratifying to the ego of a young architect to have his very first building appear on a postage stamp, together with the Cathedral of Montreal. But in truth, the only aspect of this tower that I consider still worthy of note is not the way it meets the sky, but the way it meets the ground. A levitational inversion of solid and void that prefigures my lifelong preoccupation with the question of how towers can be made to shape rather than merely preempt the space of the city. Even before the Montreal Tower was completed, I was called back to Boston in the winter of 1961 for the first of our many assignments there, the planning of Government Center. Although we designed none of its buildings, we were responsible for the urban design framework within which the various building projects were sited. We were thus responsible for reducing the number of streets within the 50-acre urban renewal area from 22 to 6. And we were responsible also for the size and shape, though not the detailed design, of the public plaza at its heart. In retrospect, it is clear that the 4 interdependent features of the Government Center plan that made it politically and economically viable were precisely those features that have made its realization so problematic. These features were, first, the substitution of a few streets for many, in order, second, to create a small number of very large building sites, so as, third, to attract government agencies, federal, state, and city, to build massive new facilities, and thus forth to justify the removal of derelict buildings in the project area. Owing to the brilliant success of this bold but arguably misconceived urban renewal strategy, Government Center Plaza remains today a space that is overscaled, underpopulated, coldly institutional, and obdurately resistant to the many efforts that have been made to bring it to life. In light of this outcome, it is perhaps worth noting that our original urban renewal plan of 1961 envisioned this central open space not as a paved plaza, but as a quiet lawn, which, had it been realized, might at least have had the virtue of not promising so much more than it could deliver. My growing doubts about the federally funded program that spawned such massive surgical interventions in the central areas of American cities were further fueled by my experience in Los Angeles, where in 1962 we were invited to plan the entirety of Bunker Hill, some 150 acres in all. As this Google Earth image shows, almost nothing that we proposed for Bunker Hill was actually built, other than the multi-level circulatory infrastructure seen here in our model, with a network of highways pretty much as they exist today. I was then at last beginning to understand the futility of attempting to impose a single design vision on a large area of a living city. And as a consequence, I was becoming much more interested in the circumstantial appeal of the fragment as opposed to the idealizing vision of the whole. One such fragment, right at the foot of Bunker Hill, there it is, the red dot, came our way 2 decades later in the commission to design Library Tower just next door to Bertram Goodhue's last great work, the Los Angeles Central Library. The stepped form of this skyscraper is governed by a concentric geometry of 12 whirling squares that is variously but rigorously manifested as the building rises from street-level lobby to its crown. I suppose this iconic form is what has made Library Tower so attractive to the makers of disaster films. Whether as the first building to be vaporized in Independence Day, hasn't quite finished? Oh, okay. Ran out, sorry. Not quite, we run down to go through that again. Or as the irresistible wraparound opportunity in Dragon Wars, one of the trashiest films ever made. I'm not sure what to make of all this. Is it kit bashing? Or could this monster be the avenging angel of Triple O? But I've once again got ahead of myself. That building was built in the 80s. Returning now to the decade of the 60s, my interest in exploring part-whole relations found opportunity in a new academic center for the State University College at Fredonia, New York, which was programmed to grow from a student body of 1,800 in 1963 to 5,200 in 1970. With the aim of giving a coherent structure to this greatly expanded campus in a flat and featureless rural landscape, we introduced two primary ordering devices: a circular road 2,200 feet in diameter and defined by a double row of poplar trees, which embraces the landscape while providing access to outlying residential, athletic, and service facilities, and a diagonally articulated spine defining the main path of pedestrian movement into and through the academic center of the college. We conceived of this spine not as a separate isolated structure, but as a continuously modulated element, half building and half landscape, integrating and energizing in a formal as much as a circulatory sense the programmatically discrete components of the campus center. The design of each of these components is intimately affected by its interaction with the spine. In other words, each bears a contingent relationship to the spine, while the spine itself, however modified by its conjunction with those components, remains by and large the autonomous directive element of the scheme. The administration building, for example, though its height gives it prominence in announcing the point of entry to the campus, is positioned and shaped in such a way that it cannot possibly be read as the center of college life, nor as its most significant entity. The library, on the other hand, appears by virtue of its central position and undisturbed rectangular roof form to be autonomous and almost independent of the spine. Yet when we look beneath the roof, we find that the convergence of the two arms of the spine within the library constitutes a major intervention shaping the space of the reading room below. In addition to its exploration of contingency and part-to-whole relationships, the academic center at Fredonia bears witness to my enthusiasm in early mid-career for a monolithic architecture of cast-in-place reinforced concrete, with its corollary celebration of spent light. That is to say, the role of daylight in shaping the perception of volume and space. A task that light performs most effectively by spending itself in its encounter with monochrome surfaces. As these photographs suggest, I was particularly engaged by the capacity of light to enliven curved surfaces, as well as the potential for visual drama that is inherent in both the interplay of solids and the juxtaposition of solid with void in a monolithic architecture. We come now to the skyscraper that most vividly exemplifies the shift in my sensibility and aspirations first evidenced in Fredonia. The floor plan of the John Hancock Tower exhibits, for the most part, a rigorous adherence to the discipline imposed by those characteristic internal systems, structural, mechanical, circulatory, operational, that largely determine the design of every tall office building. But we may observe the presence of one feature that seems to challenge the hegemony of internal systems, namely the skewing of end walls so as to produce a notched rhomboid rather than a rectangular plan form. While this deviation has been accomplished in a way that is coherent with systemic elements of the plan, it nonetheless cannot be explained by reference to any identifiable internal need. I pause here I don't think I can, does this show up on the screen? Yes, it does. This, where my arrow is pointing, that's the solid black wall at each end that Jeff was referring to and misinterpreting. But what you can see very clearly here is that the reason that wall is solid, he's provoking me to extend my lecture to say this. The reason this wall is solid, whereas all the rest of the building envelope is glass, is that this wall is the extension of the outside wall of the core, and that wall is the extension of the other outside wall of the core. Quite aside from that, Had both of these surfaces been glass, it would have been a much less interesting building, visually. Okay. A yet more pronounced aberration occurs in the plans of the lower 8 floors, where one long side of the rhomboid has been rotated outward to form a trapezoid within which the structural grid is extended to a not entirely comfortable intersection with the enclosing walls. This peculiar plan form, so radically different from the undisturbed autonomy of the cruciform tower in Montreal, becomes explicable only when one turns finally to the site plan and sees the building in its urban setting. The rhomboid tower rising from its trapezoidal base is then immediately perceived as a response to the particular external situation of the building, most notably its adjacency to Copley Square and H.H. Richardson's Trinity Church. But just what was that situation? It was our answer to this question that caused so much fear and loathing in the city of my birth. I argued that in order to understand what should be done now to revalidate this civic space, engulfed as it had been in an explosion of commerce that seemed to render it meaningless and irrelevant, we needed first to understand how it had reached this impasse, to place it, so to speak, in the stream of history. The resulting study, I don't have time to show it here, an act of radical anamnesis retracing the century-long evolution of Copley Square, led us to propose that in order to recover its vitality and draw strength from the new scale that had engulfed it, Copley Square should have its own tower. Thus was born the concept of a contingent skyscraper. That is to say, a work of architecture specifically responsive in form, material, and detail to its urban setting. In this case, the church and the public open space that are its neighbors. The storm of protest that greeted our proposal was the beginning, but unfortunately not the end, of our troubles over the ensuing 8 years of construction, during which the Hancock Tower suffered several widely publicized building failures. This all occurred before any of you were born, but you may have heard of it. Among other corrective measures, all 10,334 panels of glass in the curtain wall had to be removed and replaced. While many in Boston saw this catastrophe as deserved retribution for the egregious overreaching of the city's largest employer, not to mention their architect, an entrepreneurial t-shirt artist fortunately found a lighter side, with which I was able to outfit all 3 of my daughters in the otherwise miserable summer of 1973. Although the deceptive mutability of its image may suggest otherwise, there is nothing mysterious about the design of the Hancock Tower. It perfectly illustrates my view that the architecture of a tall building is 99% logic and 1% art, but don't you dare take away that 1%. The extreme disparity in size between the tower and the church was, of course, the central predicament we faced. We chose to deal with it not by creating a gratuitous distance between the two. This would only have exacerbated the problem, but by bringing them into close proximity while positioning and shaping the tower in such a way that it becomes the contingent satellite in a composition of which the church is unequivocally reaffirmed as the autonomous center. Thus, as a work of architecture, the Hancock Tower is defined entirely by its preoccupation with the task of reconciling, without suppressing, 2 entirely opposite and seemingly irreconcilable intentions. On the one hand, the assertion of commercial power, and on the other hand, the primacy of public buildings and civic space. To accomplish this, several aspects of the tower's design may be cited as essential. First, the attenuated rhomboid plan form, placed diagonally on its site, emphasizes the planar while minimizing the volumetric presence of the building, so as to effectively disembody the tower as seen from the square. Second, a bullnose corner detail facilitates the crucially important transition from trapezoidal base to rhomboid tower. Third, notches bisecting the end walls accentuate the weightless verticality of these planes and make legible the tower's non-rectangular geometry. Fourth, the tower's uniformly gridded and reflective surface, stripped of all elements that could suggest a third dimension, mutes the obtrusiveness of its enormous bulk and defers in all respects to the rich sculptural qualities of its much smaller neighbor. Finally, the triangular space between the church and the broad face of the tower pays homage to the apsidal view of Richardson's building, reinforcing its intended role as the architectural cynosure of Copley Square. With regard to this latter aspect, it should be noted that the three-story lobby at the base of the tower is sheathed in precisely the same manner as all other floors. Because had the monumental scale of this space been directly exposed to view, it would surely have destroyed the delicate balance in the dialogue between church and tower. In October 1980, 4 years after the tower's completion, in my inaugural lecture as architecture chair at Harvard, I summed up my view of the matter as follows. We adopted a strategy of minimalism in the design of the Hancock Tower, not for ideological reasons, but because the situation of the building demanded it. In the determined pursuit of our goal, to achieve a symbiosis between the church, the tower, and the square, we excluded everything that did not contribute directly to this end. For we believed that only thus could we temper the inherent arrogance of so large a building and endow it with a presence that might animate rather than oppress the urban scene. Today, 35 years after writing these words, I find that I can still subscribe to them. And yet I also find myself still confronting a few questions that just won't go away. Can this gesture of accommodation justify that act of transgression? Is this performance appropriate to that occasion? Does this tower belong in that city? To each of these questions, the answer, it seems to me, must finally be both yes and no. This persistently disturbing ambiguity, wherein the building discloses the anxiety of its predicament, perhaps explains why, among all my built works, the Hancock Tower is as close as I have ever come to poetry. It is also as close as I've ever come to silence. The building's restraint to a point of muteness, its refusal to reveal anything other than its obsession with its urban context, is surely its greatest strength, but also its ultimate limitation as a work of architecture. Despite the forcefulness of its gesture, the tower remains virtually speechless, and this resolute self-denial is, in the end, both its triumph and its tragedy. In a professional life, ever too much preoccupied with tall buildings, indeed, there has not been a single day in the last 6 decades when I have not been working on one or more office towers. I have nonetheless never lacked for other kinds of challenges as well. Especially welcome, coming on the heels of the Hancock troubles, was the commission to design a new wing for the Museum of Art in Portland, Maine, a small seaport city in which I happen to have deep ancestral roots. The distinguishing feature of this design problem was the need to provide extensive new facilities, more than tripling the museum's floor area, in a form that would, on one side, assert the museum's primacy in Congress Square, a civic space otherwise surrounded by commercial buildings, while on the other side granting primacy to the several much smaller buildings and surrounding gardens that constitute the museum's original campus. The stepped building form that accomplished this dual goal is composed of gallery spaces lit from above by domed clerestories, inspired by Soane's Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, allowing me to carry my passion for spent light into this disciplined but eventful interior. Like the Palazzo Caricati, the Congress Square facade of the Portland Museum performs a dual role in its city, as both the definitive enclosure of a public space and the emblematic presence of a major cultural institution. The performative demands of this latter role caused me to rethink the obligation of this regional museum not just to acknowledge, but to celebrate the traditions of its place, and prompted me to envision this building as joining rather than setting itself apart from those traditions. As you can readily understand, this was an entirely new beginning for me, in that it was the first of my built works to pursue a contextually integrative design strategy, drawing on local vernacular precedent. Portland is a city built of brick and granite, a city rich in the kind of unpretentious, serviceable architecture that achieves a certain eloquence through its modesty and directness. But vernacular buildings tend to be background buildings, and the museum clearly wanted a foreground building. This new wing was intended to initiate a kind of cultural revival in Portland, and therefore, although inspired by vernacular precedent, it had to speak in a way that would transcend that precedent. To this end, the Congress Square facade was envisioned as the two-dimensional external manifestation of the conceptual schema that defines the spatial structure of the museum, as experienced sequentially while moving through its galleries. The admission of daylight through domed clerestories is, of course, the most important distinguishing feature of the building's interior. But I also wanted the interior of this regional museum to affirm its connection to its place, not only by means of material and detail, but also by providing glimpses of the city at various points along the way. Thus, after passing through the half-domed entry, entering the Great Hall and moving up to the second floor, one cannot rise to the third without passing by the arched windows that offer views into Congress Square, after which one mounts a stairway leading to a glazed landing with views into the garden and harbor beyond. Thus, just as this building is seen from the outside as the museum in the city, so from the inside the visitor encounters the city in the museum. Fountain Place Tower in Dallas utilizes a strategy of folding to exploit the sectional possibilities of the double square diagonal that is the distinguishing feature of the Hancock Tower's plan. But despite its evident similarities in form and material, this tower is the conceptual opposite of Hancock. While Hancock adopts a posture of radical contingency, Fountain Place is resolutely autonomous, completely self-referential object, as appropriate and indeed necessary, so I believed, on a nondescript peripheral site surrounded by parking lots. As these images show, an architecture of folding requires that the curtain wall be detailed in such a way as to confine all its visible elements to a surface of zero thickness. In this instance, the form thus produced presents dramatically varied profiles when seen from different points of view, creating the illusion as one moves around it that this huge monolith 60 stories high is itself in motion, as if performing a dance. The diagram on the left shows how the tower's structural skeleton allows one half of its floor area to be cut away for a distance of 60 feet above the ground, so that Dan Kiley's densely forested water garden at its base can flow right through beneath it. An act of citizenship that animates the space of the city at street level, just as the tower's profile animates its skyline. This school of management embodies a polemic. During the decades following World War II, UCLA, like most state universities, grew exponentially. You know something about that here. And in the process, its campus was radically transformed, not just in size, but in character. The need for ever larger buildings led to an inversion of the relationship between solid and void. Whereas earlier campus buildings had helped to shape figural space, newer buildings often simply preempted space, and by their immense size and overbearing character, tended to render the spaces between them residual and meaningless. Our aim in the Anderson School was explicitly to reverse this trend. We wanted to show that even a very large building, and this was to be the second largest at UCLA, could be so configured as to restore the primacy of space over object and thus enrich rather than further impoverish the spatial fabric of the campus. To accomplish this, the building was conceived as a set of 6 separate but interconnected fragments that together shape pathways and gathering places, inviting passage from the lower to an upper campus level separated by a vertical distance of 60 feet. Thus, the most important characteristics of the Anderson School, intimacy and permeability, are placed in the service not just of its own constituency, but of the entire university community. Because this building is a close neighbor to Royce Hall, which together with Powell Library defines the emblematic heart of the UCLA campus, we thought it appropriate to employ the same Norman brick with precast concrete trim matching the limestone of those earlier buildings. But respect for precedent need not preclude formal invention, as shown here by an incision that brings the sky down into the body of the Anderson School, celebrating its axial relationship with the tower of a student union at the opposite end of the campus pathway. Now back once again to Boston, where on a spectacular waterfront site overlooking a city now so altered as to be scarcely recognizable as the city of my birth, I was at last asked to design a truly public building, a building destined to be experienced not just externally as object, but internally as space. And by its nature, inviting an architecture that, unlike the Hancock Tower, not only need not, but clearly must not remain speechless. Throughout the entire 3 years that were devoted to its design, I received important guidance from 2 passionately dedicated user clients, the federal judges, who were also my ever-patient mentors. One of them, Stephen Breyer, now sits on the Supreme Court. They explained to me at the outset that a key factor in their selection of the site was its perceived appropriateness to the status of the federal courts as both a part of and a part from the local community they served. And early on, the judges also drew my attention to another interesting paradox, that while the courts must rely extensively on precedent in adjudicating the cases before them, those cases require them to address societal problems that are often unprecedented. The Boston Courthouse embodies our shared intention to acknowledge and indeed to celebrate in architecture the opposing terms of these 2 paradoxes. While this intention is clearly evident in the building's exterior with its reference to the traditions of its place on the one hand and its emblematic departure from them on the other, it is in the experience of its interior spaces that our preoccupation with these dualities is most explicitly revealed. Having passed through a monumental entry arch, one proceeds through a skylit reception hall to a central rotunda that seems to affirm unequivocally the separateness of the judicial process from the everyday life of the street. a separateness embodied both in the serene autonomy of its cylindrical form and in the equally serene abstraction of Ellsworth Kelly's paintings on its walls. But when, upon arriving at one of the upper floors, one emerges into the gallery that gives access to the courtrooms, a panoramic view of the city and its harbor offers a vivid reminder that the courts are not so separate after all, that indeed they exist to serve the contemporary needs of the ever-changing world beyond their walls. Then, turning toward the courtroom, separateness and respect for precedent are again suggested by the half-dome entrance, and further reaffirmed within the room itself, where large arches dignify equally all participants in the judicial process: judge, jury, witnesses, and the interested public, while the domed ceiling declares the centrality of the litigants to the proceedings taking place therein. Here also, the duality between respect for precedent and openness to the unprecedented is embodied in the stenciled ornament, which recovers a long-standing New England tradition, but in a pattern that is derived from the unprecedented form of the Conard glass wall enclosing the galleries. A wall through which, upon emerging from the courtroom, one encounters once again the life of the city in all its splendid diversity. Finally, after descending to ground level and entering the harbor park, one may relax among friends, enjoy the water's edge in solitude, or perhaps turn back to look at the building that holds the park in its gentle embrace. Here one may again see the expression in architecture of those interesting dualities that preoccupied us: a part of versus apart from, and precedent versus the unprecedented. Also visibly affirmed as dusk falls is the principle that every citizen shall have equal access to the law and to the guarantee of due process embodied in an independent judiciary. Despite my fascination with ambiguity and paradox, so much in evidence here in this talk, the unambiguous assertion of this principle, that a courthouse belongs to the public and that the courts and their proceedings are open to all, was from start to finish our most important goal in the design of this federal courthouse. When I first visited the College Conservatory of Music in the fall of 1992, I found an academic community full of gifted young people and bursting with energy, but housed in perhaps the most depressing environment for teaching and learning that I had ever seen. CCM's pre-existing premises, built during the 1960s and clad largely in precast concrete, were crammed like a bone in the throat into an awkwardly shaped, steeply sloped site between a heterogeneous and disordered group of academic and residential buildings. To make matters worse, a ring of service roads preempted the surrounding residual space so that the school was effectively cut off from participation in the life of the campus. In this unattractive and tightly constrained setting, the school required new facilities that would more than double its existing floor space. Through analysis of the costs of renovation as compared with new construction, thorough analysis led us to conclude that existing performance and related support spaces should be retained and renovated, while the existing academic wing should be replaced. We also discovered that two neighboring buildings, an abandoned gymnasium and an obsolete dormitory, would lend themselves well to adaptive reuse by the school. These strategic decisions opened up the possibility of shaping a new academic wing in such a way as to frame one side of a courtyard that could then become the spatial focus for a group of buildings, both new and old, that now constitute the CCM Village. within the larger university campus. In order to permit uninterrupted operation of the school's ongoing academic programs, the project was executed in 6 separate construction phases over a 7-year period. Once in a lifetime. Many projects that I've been involved in, I can say once in a lifetime is enough, and once in a lifetime is enough for a 6-phase construction. The CCM project was one of the most deeply satisfying of my professional life because it was transformative. Fundamental to the transformation it wrought were 2 governing ideas. First, that the environmental quality of a campus, indeed of any community, can be significantly enhanced by the conservation and imaginative reuse of existing buildings in conjunction with new construction. And second, that a key goal of any campus building project, beyond providing needed facilities, must be to shape attractive and accessible gathering places, both interior and exterior, so as to engender a strong sense of shared values and shared purpose in the community they serve. Tour EDF at La Défense on the outskirts of Paris exemplifies my ongoing effort, begun with Hancock, to transmute the office tower from an autonomous into a contingent presence, to give it, so to speak, the demeanor of a good citizen, by deforming it in response to the specific circumstances of its urban context. In this case, the building's prow, located precisely on the skewed centerline of the Grande Arche, is cut away by means of a conical incision, so that the tower makes a gesture towards the historic monument in front of which it stands. At the base of this incision, a circular marquise, 20 meters in diameter, creates a gathering place where passers-by are invited to pause and enjoy the axial view of the Grande Arche from a sheltered vantage point beneath the generous canopy of stainless steel and glass. Thus does this entirely private building, it serves as the headquarters for Électricité de France, become the occasion for shaping a memorable public space. Palazzo Lombardia in Milan, the new seat of government for the Lombardy region, is located not far from that city's most famous skyscraper, Gioponti's Pirelloni. In our project, a slender bifurcated tower here emerges as the fragmentary vertical extension of sinuous intersecting strands of linear office space, themselves fragments of 11 identical circular rings that comprise the main body of this very large public building. Our tower thus assumes a form that is dual, concave, and casually composed, contrasting with and deferring to the singular convex, resolutely autonomous volume of its distinguished neighbor. The complementary and contingent status of our tower is further enhanced by the character of its enclosure, an active climate wall composed of 2 layers of glass separated by a 1 meter wide space within which vertical louvers provide efficient sun shading while allowing maximum transparency of the building envelope. Important, I believed, in a bureaucratic building full of public servants whose activities should be made visible to the people they serve. Like the tower's form, this double wall is an extension of surfaces below that enclose the low-rise office floors and shape the central piazza, together with ancillary public spaces inviting access from the surrounding city at street level. Placing now the ground floor plan of Palazzo Lombardia into its larger urban context, we can see how the concept of interweaving strands has sponsored a formally coherent transition from tower above to podium below, and thence to the sequence of street-level open spaces that join the central piazza seamlessly to the city around it. A transfiguration is thus accomplished from emblematic object on the skyline to emblematic space at street level. In discussing a few of my built works across 65 years of practice, my purpose has been at least as much to illuminate the questions asked and the problems encountered as to present the answers given and solutions devised. Addressing those of you here who now stand on the threshold of practice, I hope this exercise in selective recall, with its reference to events in my life that you must see as belonging to ancient history, may yet be in some way useful to you as you embark on your own lives in architecture. For although our profession has surely drawn strength in recent decades from a lively contemporary discourse around architecture, on the one hand, and some spectacular advances in digital technology on the other, both of which you are very much the beneficiary of in this school, nonetheless, you will encounter two fundamental conditions of practice that have remained essentially unchanged across the 15 centuries since Isidore and Anthemius responded to Justinian's command. The first of these is that owing to the expenditure of labor and material required for their production, built works of architecture are inextricably enmeshed in the belief systems and institutional mechanisms that govern human culture and society. Hence the uncomfortably intimate embrace between architecture and power, an embrace to which architecture often passively submits, within which it sometimes courageously struggles, from which it never escapes. While neither the supine posture of surrender nor the futile dream of deliverance has produced significant built works, the struggle of architecture to speak and act within and against the embrace of power has borne fruit in some of the most profoundly moving manifestations of human intelligence. The second unchanged condition of practice, corollary to the first, is that ours remains still an art of indirection. That is to say, as architects, we do not make the building. Rather, we make an elaborate set of instructions that direct the work of others who actually make the building. Hence, every built work of architecture is inescapably institutionalized, not just in the purposes it serves, but equally in the modes of its production. For between our intention and the materialization of a building, a multitude of institutional mechanisms intervene, of finance, of law, of industry, of trade, that inexorably shape and crust, encumber, and threaten to suffocate both the process and the product of our art. Why then have I persisted for 6.5 decades in a profession so relentlessly burdened? Simply because the practice of architecture is, for me, inseparable from the act of building. It is an enterprise not just of envisioning, but accomplishing a built work, with the intention that such a work, having satisfied all requirements of use and technique, may yet illuminate and give meaning to the human condition while giving shape to the physical world. And it is worth noting, finally, that the intrinsic merit of this enterprise was persuasively affirmed more than a century ago by the novelist Henry James. Viewed in this way, he wrote, "A great building is the greatest conceivable work of art. More than any other, it represents difficulties annulled, resources combined, labor, courage, patience. Thank you for your attention.